It was Sunday, December 7th, 1941, and Pearl Harbor, Hawaii awoke under a sky of almost unreal blue. Palm trees swayed lazily in the Pacific breeze, and the golden sun reflected on the calm waters of the bay. For the more than 50,000 American service members stationed there, it was a well-deserved day of rest. Many were on leave. Others, still drowsy, stretched out on the beds in their barracks, unaware that this would be the last sunrise they would see. In the kitchens, the smell of fried eggs, bacon and fresh coffee mingled with the sound of laughter and conversations about letters from home. Some played cards, others wrote to their wives, fiancées and mothers. Young soldiers, many under 20, took pictures with their pocket cameras, posing before the massive battleships anchored, symbols of strength that seemed invincible. The ships were lined up like sleeping giants, USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, among others, all lined up in what was called Battleship Row, the line of giants. They were the pride of the United States Navy. Each one carried hundreds of men on board, many at their posts, others in their bunks, reading newspapers, listening to music, unaware that the bottom of the bay would soon swallow them. From the top of the mountains surrounding the base, everything seemed so calm, like the silence before the storm. No alarms, no signs of danger, just the innocence of a country that still believed itself safe. But over the Pacific horizon, death advanced. With wings of steel and hearts of ice, more than 300 kilometers from the coast, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers cut the waters with surgical precision. Inside them, more than 400 warplanes were ready, supplied, armed, and with clear orders. Attack without mercy. While the Americans sipped coffee and chatted about the approaching Christmas, Japanese pilots received their final instructions. They weren't robots. They were flesh and blood men, trained to kill and, if necessary, die. Many carried with them rising sun flags, amulets, and farewell letters. They knew the world would change that day. Back at base, sailors hung clothes out to dry. Planes lined the runways, but none were ready for combat. The enemy was not expected. Danger was a distant thought. Pearl Harbor was a paradise. But deep in the clear sky, a buzzing sound began to grow. Weak, far away, almost imperceptible. No one knew it, but in less than an hour, this paradise would transform into a nightmare of fire, steel, and blood. Bodies would be torn apart, ships would explode, and the name Pearl Harbor would be forever etched in the memory of a nation. As the day war knocked on the door without warning, the fleet of hell in the silence of the sea. While Americans were enjoying their peaceful morning, drinking coffee and listening to music on valve radios in the heart of the Pacific, a colossal shadow moved under the guise of the waves. It was the Japanese attack force, a silent and lethal armada composed of 6 aircraft. Carriers, 2 battleships, 12 destroyers, cruisers, tankers, and submarines. It was a force never before assembled for a single blow, and it advanced like a closed fist, ready to crush. Led by the Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the Japanese sailed in absolute secrecy. The fleet zigzagged through international waters out of radar range, avoiding trade routes and guarded areas. The silence was absolute. No radios were used. The orders were clear, could not be detected before the attack. In the Gi, aircraft carrier hangars Akagi. From Yu, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku and Zuikaku, pilots sat in rows, listening to the officers' final words. The plan was meticulously calculated. The first wave of attacks was to fall on Pearl Harbor like a thunderclap from the heavens. A total surprise, a deep wound to American pride. There were more than 400 planes between dive bombers Ichi D-3A Val, torpedo boats Nakajima B-5N Kate, and agile fighters Mitsubishi A-6M-0, ready to take off as soon as the first ray of sunlight touched the sea. Many of those pilots had only 19 or 20 years old, young but disciplined, conditioned to serve the emperor to the last drop of their blood. They had trained for months in secret. They knew where to strike. They knew when. They knew that victory depended on surprise. There was no room for error. To the 3:42 a.m., the Japanese submarine I-20 released one of its midget submarines, carrying 2 crew members heading for Pearl Harbor. It was the first sign that the attack had begun, although the Americans didn't know it yet. 4 other midget submarines were also dispatched, planning to infiltrate the harbor before the planes. To the 600 on the deck of the aircraft carriers, the moment has arrived. The first engines began to roar, swallowing the silence of the sea. One by one, planes began to take off from the decks. Their wings were laden with bombs, torpedoes, and death. They were black eagles taking flight to spread fire and destruction. The sky above the Pacific began to fill with black spots. The sun illuminated them in an almost poetic way, but there was nothing beautiful about that image. They were angels of death, flying toward an unsuspecting base. Every second that passed brought them closer to their target. Pearl Harbor still slept. Bethel was flying at full speed to wake America with the sound of the apocalypse. The message never delivered on time. As Japanese planes streaked across the Pacific skies, advancing like a steel cloud toward the sleeping paradise of Pearl Harbor, Washington, D.C., thousands of miles away, a silent drama was unfolding. A drama that, if it had happened in time, maybe, just maybe, could have changed the course of that bloody morning. The Japanese government had prepared a diplomatic message in 14 parts. It was in practice a veiled declaration of a break in peace negotiations with the United States. The Japanese plan was clear. Diplomats in Washington were to deliver the last part of the document exactly 30 minutes before the attack began. It was a formality, a way to maintain the appearance of honor in the cowardly act of a surprise attack. But something went wrong. Japanese diplomats Saburo Kurusu and Kichisaburo Nomura had the message, but it took them too long to decode and type it. Meanwhile, the planes were already in the air. The clock was ticking, and every second of delay meant more American lives trapped in the web of the unknown. To the 1 p.m. Washington time, the exact moment when the bomb that would destroy the USS Arizona was already flying over the Pacific. The last part of the message had not yet been delivered to the Secretary of State Cordell Hull. When it finally reached your hands, it was too late. The attack had begun. Upon reading the contents, Hull exploded in fury. He called the diplomats traitors to their faces. He looked at them both as if he were looking at the Emperor of Japan himself. But at that moment, instead of words, what spoke louder were the explosions in Honolulu. As Washington learned with shock the extent of the diplomatic betrayal, the skies over Pearl Harbor filled with engines, smoke, and flaming steel. Diplomacy died there, silent, bureaucratic, and useless before the roar of war. Pearl Harbor would receive no warning. Japan would not declare war before attacking. The blow would come with the sun and with the blood. The ignored radar points. Shortly after 7 a.m., still early on that sultry Sunday, 2 American soldiers from the base disabled on the north side of the island of Oahu were on radar monitoring duty, a technology that was still new, experimental, and not taken seriously by senior officers. The operators, George Elliott and Joseph Lockard, watched the circular screen intently, waiting for signs of American aircraft. It was just a routine exercise, but suddenly a huge group of dots began to appear on the radar. A swarm over 180 targets, a dense formation coming from the north. It was something they had never seen before. They immediately called the information center at Fort Shafter. The call reached the Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, newly appointed, inexperienced, and without any technical support. Upon hearing the warning, his response was simple and tragic. Don't worry, it must be the B-17s coming from California. The error was fatal. What the 2 young men saw on that screen was not a group of friendly bombers. They were the Zero fighters, the Val bombers, and the Kate torpedo bombers of the first wave of the Japanese attack. already descending upon Oahu in combat formation. They were less than 50 kilometers from the base. It was the last moment the Americans could have reacted, but no one sounded the alarm. The newly created radar was ignored. The confidence that the US was unattainable still hung like a veil over the chain of command. Meanwhile, in the cockpits of the Japanese planes, the pilots made final adjustments to their instruments. The target ahead was clear. The ships, lined up like ducks on a pond, were ready for destruction. The warning window had closed. The chance to defend itself had evaporated. Now, the attack was inevitable. The next sound Americans would hear would not be sirens. It would be the roar of bombs cutting through the sky. The first cry from hell. 7:48 in the morning. The sky was already burning golden over Pearl Harbor when suddenly the silence was torn by a mechanical thunder. A boom, then another, and then dozens. The sound of Japanese. Plane engines cut through the air like blades. Above, the first fighters appeared, Mitsubishi A6M0, swift and lethal, like birds of prey diving for the kill. Behind them, in perfect formation, the Val dive bombers and their torpederos Kate, carrying tons of explosives. On Japanese radio, a single code was transmitted. Tora! 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 It was the signal all the pilots were waiting for. It meant the surprise attack was successful. There was no defense. There was no warning. America slept. Now, she would bleed. The first bomb fell on the Wheeler Field airfield, exploding amid hangars and planes lined up like targets. American airmen were thrown through the air, bodies torn apart, metal twisted. Burning men ran desperately. At the same time, the torpedo boats glided low over the waters of the bay, launching their metallic fish against the ship's flanks. USS Utah was one of the first to be hit. A torpedo ripped through its hull with a dull thud. The ship rocked, then began to list. From the deck of the USS Arizona, sailors ran aimlessly. Some weren't even in uniform. They'd been awakened by the sound of explosions. Others tried desperately to reach the anti-aircraft guns, but it was too late. The Japanese were already on top. The bombs fell like black rain. In a matter of minutes, the Hawaiian paradise turned into a hell of flaming steel. The waves of the bay turned red. The skies, once clear, were now covered in smoke, screams, and death. The first wave had begun, and the first. Scream from Helicode over the Pacific, a cry that would forever mark the history of the United States and the fate of World War II. The heavens on fire Pearl Harbor, minutes after the attack began, was no longer a military port. It was a floating battlefield, a slaughterhouse in the middle of paradise, and at the top, the heavens seemed to spit fire. 0 fighters, they zigzagged through the air, machine gunning anything that moved. American planes were still parked side by side on the runways, lined up like easy targets, a safeguard against sabotage that had become a curse. The Japanese fired mercilessly at them. Within seconds, P-40 planes exploded like burning toys, throwing pieces of wings and bodies into the air. The field of Hickam Field and the bases of Wheeler were in flames. Hangar after hangar collapsed under the explosions. The sound was deafening, engines screaming, bombs exploding, the crackling of flames and the screams of the wounded. Amid the smoke, some American soldiers tried to run to the anti-aircraft guns. Some managed to fire a few rounds at the invaders, but most fell before even reaching the guns. They were shot on the ground like cornered prey. From the deck of the ships, the scene was even more terrifying. Entire crews looked up helplessly while 250 Ku bombs dove straight over their heads. The enemy planes descended in precise curves, dropping their explosives with murderous coldness. In the sky, planes exploded in the air and pieces of fuselage fell like deadly rain. Japanese pilots killed in action plummeted with their machines ablaze, plunging into the sea like torches. The clouds, tinted by smoke and the reflections of the flames, gained shades of red, orange and black. It was as if the sky itself were on fire, a hellish spectacle that no human eye could forget. Pearl Harbor ardier, and the heavens before silent, now they roared like enraged dragons. The agony of ships in port, a floating hell. On the fateful morning of December 7th, 1941, what should have been a peaceful and routine Sunday for the United States Navy's Pacific Fleet turned into an unspeakable nightmare. Pearl Harbor, a natural sanctuary of calm, deep waters, became the scene of unprecedented carnage, a watery graveyard for the steel giants that rested there. The Japanese surprise attack wasn't just about destroying ships. It sought to annihilate a nation's morale and ability to respond, and it did so with a brutality that would echo for decades. The first rays of sunlight had barely dispelled the morning mist when the distant drone of hundreds of Japanese aircraft shattered the silence. It wasn't a drill. It wasn't a false alarm. It was war at its most cruel and unexpected. The Japanese pilots, trained with almost fanatical precision, swooped down from the skies like vultures, their targets clearly defined. The battleships of Battleship Row, the backbone of the American fleet. O Alvo Principal, a battleship row. Off Ford Island, 8 of the Pacific. Fleet's 9 battleships were tied up side by side in a formation that, in peacetime, was convenient, but in war, proved a death trap. The USS California, USS Maryland, USS Oklahoma, USS Tennessee, USS West Virginia, USS Arizona, USS Nevada, and the USS Pennsylvania, the latter in dry dock, represented American naval might. Each was a floating fortress designed to withstand the most severe combat. But against the speed and surprise of Japanese torpedo boats and bombers, their imposing presence became their greatest vulnerability. The torpedoes, specially adapted for the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor with the addition of wooden fins, were the most devastating weapons of the first attack. Launched at low altitude, they tore through the surface of the water, leaving a trail of foam before striking their targets with seismic force. The sound of the explosions was deafening, a chorus of twisting metal, gushing water, and men's screams. The cavalry of the USS West Virginia. The USS West Virginia BB-48, a Colorado-class battleship, was one of the first to feel the brunt of the attack. 7 torpedoes, one after the other, struck her portside, opening colossal holes in her hull. Salt water rushed into the ship at terrifying speed, flooding compartments, engine rooms, and storerooms. The ship's internal structure, designed to withstand projectile impacts, was no match for the torpedo's explosive force. The ship began to list rapidly, her bows sinking while her stern rose, and precariously. Inside the West Virginia, chaos was absolute. The lights went out, plunging the corridors into claustrophobic darkness. The smell of diesel fuel, smoke, and blood mingled in the air. Sailors ran desperately, trying to contain the flooding, rescue trapped colleagues, or reach their battle stations. Many were swept away by the waves of water that burst through the leaks, dragged to the bottom of the ship or into the waters of the bay. Others were struck by metal shrapnel, burned by secondary explosions, or crushed by the ship's own structure as it contorted under the impact. The ship's captain, Mervyn S. Bennion, was mortally wounded by shrapnel while trying to organize the defense. His sacrifice, like that of so many others, would be a testament to bravery in the midst of desperation, and virada fatal to the USS Oklahoma. Alongside the West Virginia, the USS Oklahoma BB-37, a Nevada-class battleship, faced an even more horrific fate. Hit by at least 9 torpedoes, the Oklahoma began listing almost immediately. The speed with which water flooded its lower compartments was terrifying. In less than 12 minutes, the ship capsized completely, exposing its keel to the sky. The scene was surreal. A war giant lying on its side, like a wounded animal in its final breaths. Hundreds of sailors were trapped inside the capsized hull. The air was thin, the darkness was complete, and panic set in. Some managed to find small pockets of air, but most were doomed. The Sounds of desperate pounding on the steel hull echoed across the bay, an agonized wail of men fighting for their last breaths. Rescue teams would attempt, in the hours and days that followed, to cut through the hull to reach the survivors. But most of the 429 men aboard the Oklahoma who died that day perished by drowning or asphyxiation. The image of the capsized Oklahoma, with its rusted keel exposed, became a grim symbol of the vulnerability of the American fleet. The cataclysmic blow on the USS Arizona, but the most brutal, iconic, and devastating blow of the entire attack was delivered to the USS Arizona BB-39, a Pennsylvania-class battleship and a symbol of American naval power. The Arizona was hit by an 800 kilos armor-piercing bomb, converted from a 16-inch battleship shell. The bomb, dropped from a dive bomber, tore through the armored deck and penetrated deep into the ship, striking the main ammunition magazine located under the bow turret. The resulting explosion was of apocalyptic magnitude. A blinding white flash engulfed the ship, followed by a tower of fire that rose hundreds of meters into the air, forming a mushroom cloud of smoke and flames visible for miles. The Arizona's 30,000-ton hull was literally split in two, its steel structure twisted and disintegrated by the force of the detonation. Men were thrown through the air like dolls, their bodies dismembered by the blast. The deck, once a massive steel platform, flew to pieces, revealing the inferno. Unfolding below, in a matter of seconds, 1,177 men aboard the Arizona were killed, most instantly. Many of them were asleep in their bunks, others at their battle stations, never even having a chance to understand what had hit them. The Arizona sank quickly, taking most of her crew with her. Today, the ship lies at the bottom of Pearl Harbor Bay, a war grave and a permanent memorial to those who lost their lives. The oil that still slowly leaks from her tanks, forming iridescent stains on the water surface, is known as the Tears of the Arizona, a somber reminder of the tragedy. The post-blast scenario, a floating graveyard. The harbor, once a scene of military tranquility, had turned into a living hell. The bay's once turquoise waters turned a dark, oily red, a macabre mixture of blood, fuel oil, and ash. Bodies floated among the wreckage, some unrecognizable, others with expressions of terror frozen on their faces. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke, gunpowder, and burning, of flesh. The ships that were still afloat, like the Nevada, desperately trying to escape to open sea, were constant targets for Japanese bombers. The groaning of ships, the creak of bending steel, and the sound of secondary explosions from ammunition and fuel tanks created a symphony of agony. Rescue teams, firefighters, and medics raced against time, trying to save the injured, put out the fires, and rescue survivors. But the scale of the devastation was overwhelming. With every passing minute, more lives were lost, more ships were damaged, and more hope dwindled. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just a military event, it was a national trauma. The agony of the ships in the harbor, the loss of innocent lives, and the destruction of a powerful fleet awakened a slumbering nation and propelled it into World War II. The image of the burning ships sinking in their own waters became a symbol of American betrayal and resilience. And as the attack continued, the most painful lesson of all was being learned. War had come, and it would take no prisoners. The horror of battle, minute by minute. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not a static event, but a dynamic sequence of horrors that unfolded in a matter of minutes. The first wave of Japanese aircraft, consisting of 183 planes, including dive bombers, high-level bombers, and torpedo bombers, struck the base at 7:55 a.m. The surprise was almost total. Many sailors were still eating breakfast. Others were preparing for their Sunday. Routine, the sound of the alarm sirens, when they finally sounded, was drowned out by the roar of aircraft engines and explosions. The devastation on Battleship Row continues. As the West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Arizona succumbed, other ships in Battleship Row also faced their own inferno. The USS California BB-44, a Tennessee-class battleship, was hit by 2 torpedoes and a bomb. Water quickly flooded the ship, and despite the crew's heroic efforts to contain the flooding, the California began to slowly sink, settling in the shallow bottom of the harbor. Dense smoke and burning oil surrounding the ship hampered rescue efforts and the evacuation of the injured. Many sailors were forced to swim through the burning oil to reach the safety of shore or other ships. The USS Maryland BB-46 and USS Tennessee BB-43, both Colorado-class battleships, were more fortunate, but they did not escape unscathed. The Maryland was hit by 2 armor-piercing bombs, but her superior armor and the depth of water beneath her hull prevented catastrophic damage. The Tennessee was hit by 2 bombs and suffered significant fire damage due to burning oil from the Arizona and the West Virginia that spread into the water. The Tennessee's crew bravely fought the fires, using hoses and buckets, while desperately trying to free themselves from the burning West Virginia. The USS Nevada BB-36, a Nevada-class battleship, was the only one able to move during the attack. After being hit by a torpedo and several bombs, the Nevada managed to gain steam and began moving toward the harbor exit, hoping to run aground in shallower waters and avoid sinking completely. However, she became a prime target for the second wave of Japanese attacks. Dive bombers concentrated their attacks on the Nevada, which was hit by more bombs, forcing her to run aground at Hospital Point to avoid blocking the shipping channel. The image of the Nevada in flames, with her bow pointing out of the harbor, became a symbol of American resistance. The fight for survival, unsung heroes. Amid the chaos and destruction, countless stories of heroism and sacrifice emerged. Sailors, many of them young and inexperienced, acted with courage and determination. Men risked their lives to rescue colleagues trapped in flooded compartments, to put out fires that threatened to consume their ships, or to operate the few anti-aircraft guns they could fire. American anti-aircraft fire, initially disorganized and ineffective, due to the surprise of the attack, began to intensify as the sailors recovered from the initial shock and sprang into action. Doctors and nurses on ships and in medical facilities on land faced an avalanche of wounded, many with severe burns, shrapnel wounds, and psychological trauma. Makeshift hospitals were set up everywhere, and medical personnel worked tirelessly, often under enemy fire, to save lives. Blood and sweat mixed on the hospital floors, while the sounds of planes and explosions continued to echo, the immediate consequences and the legacy. By the end of the attack, which lasted just over 90 minutes, the devastation was shocking. 4 battleships were sunk. The Arizona and Oklahoma were total losses, while the West Virginia and California were later salvaged and repaired, and 4 others were damaged. Numerous other ships, including cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels, were also damaged or sunk. More than 2,400 Americans were killed, and about 1,000 were wounded. The Army, Air Force, and Naval Aviation also suffered significant losses, with hundreds of aircraft destroyed or damaged on the ground. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a turning point in history. It not only marked the United States' entry into World War II, but also changed the perception of naval warfare. The era of battleships as the backbone of a fleet was coming to an end, giving way to the rise of aircraft carriers. The agony of the ships in Pearl Harbor and the sacrifice of so many men served as a grim reminder of the brutality of war and the importance of vigilance. Pearl Harbor's legacy continues to resonate, a testament to human resilience in the face of adversity and an eternal memorial to those who lost their lives on that fateful day. Grim details of survival and death. Beyond the ship numbers and names, the true agony of Pearl Harbor lay in the individual experiences of thousands of men. That Sunday, which began with the promise of a day off and relaxation, turned into a nightmare of fire, smoke, water, and death, The stories of survival are as moving as those of loss, and both paint a vivid picture of the horror that befell the naval base. Liquid hell, oil and fire, in the bay. One of the most terrifying aspects of the attack was the rapid formation of a liquid inferno in the bay. The torpedoes and bombs that struck the ships ruptured their fuel tanks, releasing thousands of gallons of diesel and bunker fuel into the water. This oil, lighter than water, quickly spread across the surface, forming a thick, flammable layer. When the explosions and fires aboard the ships reached this layer of oil, the entire bay was transformed into a sea of flames. Sailors who managed to escape their burning ships or who were thrown overboard by the explosions found themselves in a desperate situation. Swimming through the burning oil meant facing horrific burns and inhaling toxic fumes. Many were seen swimming desperately, their bodies engulfed in flames, while others, already injured, succumbed to the fire and smoke. Rescue efforts were hampered by reduced visibility and the intense heat emanating from the burning water. Small rescue vessels, such as tugboats and patrol boats, bravely navigated the inferno, pulling survivors from the water, many of them severely burned and in shock. The desperation of prisoners, the Oklahoma case. The fate of the sailors trapped inside the capsized USS Oklahoma is one of the darkest chapters of the attack. When the ship capsized, hundreds of men were plunged into complete darkness. Water rushed into the lower compartments at a terrifying speed, and air became a precious commodity. Those not immediately drowned or crushed by the ship's twisting found themselves trapped in air pockets, trapped in a maze of twisted metal and frigid water. The pounding sounds of the Oklahoma's hull were heard for hours, a testament to the desperate struggle for survival. Rescue teams, using blowtorches and cutting tools, worked tirelessly to cut holes in the ship's hull. The work was dangerous and exhausting, with the constant risk of further explosions or the ship moving further. Over the next few days, 32 men were rescued alive from the Oklahoma's interior, a remarkable feat given the conditions. However, for many, help came too late. Most of the Oklahoma's 429 dead were found inside the ship, victims of drowning or asphyxiation, their lives snuffed out in a steel tomb. The response and resilience. Despite the shock and devastation, the American response was remarkable. Sailors, soldiers, and civilians acted with bravery and determination. Anti-aircraft batteries, initially taken by surprise, began firing more effectively as the attack progressed. American pilots, some still in their pajamas, rushed to their planes and took off to engage the invaders, despite the overwhelming Japanese numerical superiority. Lieutenant George Welch and Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor, for example, managed to shoot down several Japanese planes, becoming some of the first American heroes of the war. Rescue and recovery efforts began almost immediately and continued for weeks and months. Divers worked to recover bodies and attempt to salvage equipment from the sunken ships. Engineers and repair crews began assessing the damage and planning the salvage of salvageable ships. The determination to raise and repair the damaged ships, especially the West Virginia and California, which were later reinstated in the fleet and participated in major battles, demonstrated the resilience of the U.S. Navy. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a traumatic event, but also a catalyst. It united a nation and propelled it into war with unwavering determination. The agony of the ships in the harbor, the lives lost, and the scars left by the attack served as a constant reminder of the cost of war and the importance of vigilance. The memory of Pearl Harbor and the men who perished there remains a pillar of American history, a testament to the fragility of peace and the strength of the human spirit in the face of extreme adversity. The Japanese perspective, precision and fanaticism. To fully understand the ship's agony at Pearl Harbor, it is crucial to analyze the Japanese perspective. The attack, known as Operation Zed, was meticulously planned and executed with a precision and fanaticism that shocked the world. The goal was not only to destroy the Pacific Fleet, but also to deliver a psychological blow that, in the Japanese view, would force the United States to accept Japanese expansion in Asia and the Pacific. Training and technology. The Japanese pilots who participated in the attack were the elite of Japanese naval aviation. They spent months training in secret in a bay in Japan that resembled Pearl Harbor. They practiced dropping torpedoes in shallow water, a technique considered nearly impossible at the time, until Japanese engineers developed special wooden fins that stabilized the torpedoes and prevented them from sinking into the mud. Dive bombers practiced precision strikes against moving targets, and fighter pilots trained to escort the bombers and neutralize any American air resistance. Japanese aircraft, such as the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, the Aichi D3A Val dive bomber, and the Nakajima B5N Kate torpedo bomber, were technologically advanced and in many ways superior to American aircraft of the time. The Zero in particular was known for its maneuverability and range, and dominated the skies over the Pacific in the early months of the war. The execution of the attack. The Japanese attack force, led by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, consisted of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. The fleet sailed in radio silence for more than 3,500 miles across the North Pacific, avoiding commercial shipping lanes to maintain the element of surprise. At dawn on December 7th, the first attack wave took off from the carriers, about 230 miles north of Oahu. The Japanese pilots followed a detailed plan, with specific targets assigned to each squadron. The first wave concentrated on the battleships and airfields, while the second wave, arriving about an hour later, targeted the cruisers, destroyers, and other port facilities. The discipline and precision of the Japanese pilots were remarkable. They flew in tight formation, facing American anti-aircraft fire with calm and determination, and dropped their bombs and torpedoes with deadly accuracy. The strategic failure. Despite its overwhelming tactical success, the attack on Pearl Harbor was ultimately a strategic failure for Japan. It failed to destroy the American aircraft carriers, which were at sea on a training mission and thus escaped attack. Aircraft carriers would become the decisive weapon in the Pacific War, and their survival allowed the United States to recover and counterattack much more quickly than the Japanese expected. Furthermore, the attack did not destroy Pearl Harbor's ship repair facilities and fuel depots, which were crucial to the U.S. Navy's ability to operate in the Pacific. Recovery and repair of damaged ships was much faster than the Japanese anticipated, and the Pacific Fleet, while severely damaged, was not permanently incapacitated. Most importantly, the attack on Pearl Harbor united the American people in a way nothing else could have. The sense of betrayal and outrage transformed an isolationist nation into a military powerhouse determined to achieve victory at any cost. The battle cry, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a powerful symbol of unity and determination, propelling the United States to ultimate victory in World War II. Conclusion: a legacy of fire and memory. The agony of the ships in Pearl Harbor is a story of destruction, death, heroism, and resilience. It's a story that transcends history books and has become part of the American collective consciousness. The image of the burning ships, the sound of explosions, and the screams of the men are a grim reminder of the cost of war and the fragility of peace. Today, the USS Arizona Memorial, built on the wreckage of the sunken ship, is a place of pilgrimage and reflection. Millions of visitors from around the world come to pay tribute to those who died and to learn about the events of that fateful day. The tears of Arizona, the oil still leaking from the ship, are a constant reminder of the tragedy and sacrifice. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a world-changing event. It marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. It awakened a sleeping giant and propelled it onto the world stage as a superpower. And above all, it left a legacy of memory, a reminder that freedom has a price and that peace must always be defended. The agony of the ships in Pearl Harbor may be over, but the memory of that day will live forever. The bitter lessons of Pearl Harbor: vigilance and preparedness. The attack on Pearl Harbor, though a devastating event, served as a catalyst for a series of profound changes in U.S. military doctrine and intelligence. The lessons learned on that fateful day shaped how nations would prepare for war and how intelligence would be collected and analyzed in the future. The ship's agony in the harbor was not only a tragedy, but a painful yet essential learning experience: the failure of intelligence and the surprise. One of the most bitter lessons of Pearl Harbor was the failure of intelligence to predict the nature and scale of the attack. Although there were warning signs, such as increased Japanese naval activity and the breaking of diplomatic codes, these signals were not interpreted correctly or communicated effectively to authorities at Pearl Harbor. The prevailing belief was that any Japanese attack would focus on the Philippines or other American possessions in the Western Pacific, rather than the naval base in Hawaii itself. This failure highlighted the critical need for stronger intelligence coordination, more comprehensive analysis of available information, and clear and timely communication between the different branches of the military. The surprise of the attack was a key factor in its initial success, and from then on, preventing surprise attacks became a top national security priority. Fleet vulnerability and the rise of air power. Pearl Harbor exposed the vulnerability of battleships to coordinated air attacks. Prior to the attack, naval doctrine was still heavily focused on battleship warfare, where large warships would engage in gunnery duels. However, the devastation wrought by Japanese torpedo boats and bombers demonstrated unequivocally that air power, especially carrier-based air power, had become the dominant force in naval warfare. The survival of the American aircraft carriers, which were at sea during the attack, was a crucial stroke of luck. This luck, combined with the lessons learned at Pearl Harbor, accelerated the U.S. Navy's transition to a carrier-centric fleet. Aircraft carriers, with their ability to launch and recover aircraft from hundreds of miles away, offered a flexibility and range that battleships simply could not match. The ship's agony in harbor, therefore, marked the end of one era and the beginning of another in naval history. The mobilization of a nation. Perhaps the most profound lesson of Pearl Harbor was a nation's ability to mobilize and unite in the face of adversity. Before the attack, the United States was divided on whether to enter World War II. Isolationism was a powerful force in American politics, and many believed the country should avoid involvement in European and Asian conflicts. However, the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. Outrage and shock united the American people in an unprecedented way. The attack was seen as an act of treason and a direct affront to American sovereignty. From that day on, the nation mobilized for war with unwavering determination and purpose. Factories were converted to war production. Millions of men and women enlisted in the armed forces, and the country became an arsenal of democracy. The agony of the ships in the harbor and the sacrifice of so many galvanized the will of a nation and propelled it to victory. The continuing legacy, memory, and surveillance. More than 8 decades after the attack, the legacy of Pearl Harbor continues to resonate. The USS Arizona Memorial, with the sunken ship still visible beneath the waters, serves as a solemn reminder of the cost of war. The tears of the Arizona, the oil still leaking from the ship, is a continuing testament to the tragedy and sacrifice. For future generations, Pearl Harbor is more than a historical event. It is a parable about the importance of vigilance, preparedness, and unity. It is a reminder that peace is fragile and that freedom must be constantly defended. The agony of the ships in the harbor, the lives lost, and the scars left by the attack are an indelible part of American history, a testament to human resilience and a nation's ability to rise from the ashes of tragedy and forge a stronger, more secure future. Recovery and rebirth, from destruction to reconstruction. After the initial shock and devastation, the Pearl Harbor Naval Base, and indeed the entire American nation, embarked on a monumental process of recovery and reconstruction. The ship's agony in the harbor was not the end, but rather a catalyst for an unprecedented display of ingenuity, resilience, and determination. The recovery of the damaged ships and the reconstruction of the base were Herculean tasks that mobilized thousands of workers and resources, transforming the tragedy into a testament to resilience. The rescue and repair efforts. Almost immediately after the attack, rescue operations began. Divers, naval engineers, and rescue teams worked tirelessly to assess the damage, recover bodies, and attempt to salvage what remained of the ships. The underwater scene was one of chaos, scattered wreckage, floating bodies, and capsized or partially submerged ships. Visibility was nearly zero, and the dangers were immense, including secondary explosions, oil leaks, and unstable structures. The initial focus was on ships that could be salvaged and repaired. The USS West Virginia and the USS California, though severely damaged and sunk in shallow water, were deemed salvageable. Engineers and civilian and military workers worked around-the-clock 24/7 shifts. They pumped water from the hulls, sealed leaks, and stabilized the ships so they could be refloated. It was a slow and painstaking process that required innovative solutions to unprecedented problems. Oklahoma, upside down, posed an even greater challenge. The decision was made to right and refloat her, a naval engineering operation never before attempted on such a scale. Using a series of winches and cables, Oklahoma was slowly pulled back to an upright position, a process that took months and required incredible precision. Although Oklahoma never returned to active service as a warship, her recovery was a triumph of engineering and a symbol of American resolve. Base reconstruction and war production. While the ships were being recovered, the Pearl Harbor Naval Base also underwent a massive transformation. Destroyed hangars were rebuilt, runways repaired, and ship repair facilities expanded. Pearl Harbor's ability to serve as a forward base for naval operations in the Pacific was crucial to the war effort, and the speed with which the base was restored and modernized was remarkable. Across the country, American industry mobilized for war production on an unprecedented scale. Factories that had previously produced automobiles and appliances were converted to manufacture tanks, planes, and ships. The workforce, including millions of women entering factories for the first time, worked tirelessly to meet the needs of the armed forces. The death throes of the ships at Pearl Harbor were a catalyst for this industrial mobilization, transforming the United States into the arsenal of democracy and the primary supplier of war material to the Allies. The impact on American naval strategy. The attack on Pearl Harbor not only accelerated the transition to war, but also forced a fundamental reassessment of American naval strategy. The vulnerability of battleships to air attack, demonstrated so dramatically at Pearl Harbor, solidified the position of the aircraft carrier as the backbone of the fleet. From then on, carrier construction became a top priority, and American naval doctrine adapted to reflect this new reality. The ships that were salvaged and repaired at Pearl Harbor, such as the West Virginia and the California, returned to action and participated in crucial battles in the Pacific, including the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. Their presence in these battles was a testament to the U.S. Navy's resilience and ability to recover after such a devastating blow. The agility and adaptability demonstrated after Pearl Harbor were crucial to the Allied victory in the Pacific. In short, the ship's agony at Pearl Harbor was a moment of crisis that, paradoxically, revealed the strength and resolve of a nation. The recovery and rebirth that followed the attack were not just a matter of physical reconstruction, but a reaffirmation of the American spirit and a testament to the ability to overcome adversity and emerge even stronger. The human price. Beyond the ships, the lives. While the destruction of the ships at Pearl Harbor is a central focus, the true tragedy of the attack lies in the lives lost and the scars, both physical and psychological, left on the survivors. The agony was not just for the steel ships, but for the flesh and blood men who crewed them, their families, and an entire nation forced to confront the brutality of war in a visceral way. The initial chaos and confusion. In the first minutes of the attack, chaos and confusion were the norm. The deafening sound of explosions, the roar of planes, and the smell of smoke and fuel created an atmosphere of indescribable terror. Many sailors, caught off guard in their bunks or at breakfast, had only seconds to react. The lack of advance warning meant that anti-aircraft defenses were unprepared, and many ships were in a reduced state of readiness, with hatches open and watertight doors unlocked, which accelerated the flooding. Those who managed to escape the burning ships or were thrown into the water faced a new nightmare. The bay, once a safe haven, turned into a liquid hell of burning oil, floating wreckage, and bodies. Many sailors, even strong swimmers, succumbed to the toxic smoke, intense heat, and lack of oxygen. Screams of pain and despair echoed across the bay, mingling with the sound of explosions and gunfire. The USS Oklahoma, dead standing. As the USS Arizona exploded in a ball of fire and the USS West Virginia sank in agony, the USS Oklahoma, I was living a different nightmare. A nightmare in slow motion. They were 7:55 when the first torpedoes struck the Oklahoma's starboard flank. The armored hull groaned. The ship shook as if punched in the gut. And before the crew could react, other torpedoes came. 1, 2, 3, up to 9 in all. The impact was so violent that the ship began to lean dangerously to the right side. Sailors slipped through the corridors, stumbling on water. Blood and oil. The floor was no longer a floor, it was a wall. The ceiling became a floor. The steel giant was turning upside down. In a matter of minutes, the USS Oklahoma completely capsized, turning its hull to the sky like a dead whale. More than 400 men were trapped inside the ship. No light, no air, no escape. Outside, a desperate silence. But inside, the fight for life began. On the capsized hull, sailors were pounding on the steel with wrenches, hammers, and even their bare fists. Tock, tock, a tock. It was the sound of hope or despair, a silent code. We're alive in here. Outside, rescue teams raced against time. They attempted to breach the hull with blowtorches, pneumatic hammers, anything that could create a breach. Each cut in the steel was another breath for the men trapped in darkness. But time does not forgive. The air grew thin, the water rose, and the heat inside the capsized hull became suffocating. Many died in silence, leaning against the walls of the ship, standing because there was no room to fall. They died standing in the darkness, waiting. The Oklahoma sank slowly, its hull a metal tomb, and the men who had pounded, screamed, and waited, many of them would never be found again. There, on that capsized ship, heroism and horror blended into one. The chaotic reaction. As Pearl Harbor turned into a sea of fire and destruction within the base's walls, the American response was anything but organized. The shock of the surprise attack hit American forces like a punch in the gut, brutal, cruel, unexpected. Pilots rushed to their aircraft, many still in pajamas or incomplete uniforms, without even time to fully gear up. The hangars were ablaze, planes were exploding all around, but determination spoke louder than fear. It was time to fight or die. However, chaos was total. Communications were cut or interrupted. Warning messages arrived late or were lost in the confusion. Officers tried to issue orders, but no one knew exactly the extent of the attack or whether there would be a second strike. Many soldiers tried to access the anti-aircraft guns scattered throughout the harbor, but most were unarmed or without ammunition. The rush to defend themselves was immense, but surprise and panic had consumed any quick reaction. In the air, some pilots managed to take off in their P-40 Warhawks and Curtiss P-36 Hawks, engaging the Japanese fighters in unequal combat. These were desperate acts of courage. Vastly outnumbered planes, piloted by exhausted men, pitted against faster machines trained to kill. Meanwhile, on the ships, firefighting crews struggled to control the raging flames, while anti-aircraft gunners tried to shoot down the invaders that passed like murderous shadows. But the cruel truth was this: nothing could stop the fury of that morning. The enemy had attacked with precision and brutality. The result was a battlefield where disorganization and fear tried, in vain, to contain the storm of death and destruction. The attack had broken the aura of American invincibility. Now, it was a matter of survival. Two-wave attack. The first wave of Japanese planes had plunged Pearl Harbor into absolute chaos. But the offensive wouldn't end there. No sooner had the Americans begun to assimilate the initial devastation than a second wave of attack approached. To the 8:40 a.m., the engines roared again on the horizon. This second wave brought even more bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters, carrying the mission of completing the destruction begun minutes before. The Japanese knew that to ensure complete success, they needed to eliminate the last American air forces, wipe out the remaining ships, and destroy the base's essential facilities. Once again, the sky filled with smoke and fire. Smoke from the first wave's fires had already formed a black cloud that hung over the bay, while bombs continued to rain down like meteors. This time the focus was different. The hangars and warehouses that were still intact, the fuel depots and the communications areas. The USS Nevada, which had managed to escape the harbor during the first wave, was one of the main targets of the second. Attempting to escape to the open sea, she was hit by a barrage of torpedoes and anti-aircraft fire. Even so, Nevada held out and managed to escape the attack, although heavily damaged. At the same time, Japanese planes continued to bomb airfields, attempting to destroy any aircraft that might threaten future Japanese actions. But despite the destruction, American resistance was beginning to form. Anti-aircraft guns began to find their rhythm, and surviving pilots took off to face the invaders with renewed ferocity. Even so, the second wave brought more death, more destruction, and more tears to Pearl Harbor. Less than 2 hours after the attack began, the port was unrecognizable. Horror in hospitals. With smoke still rising over Pearl Harbor and the echoes of the explosion still ringing in the air, attention turned to the island's military hospitals, places that, on that fateful Sunday, became veritable battlefields in their own right. Hundreds of wounded were rushed to the hospital, many carried by colleagues, others dragging themselves through rubble and flames. Men with mangled bodies, broken bones, and third-degree burns, burned alive by the fire that consumed ships and hangars. The doctors and nurses, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the tragedy, faced a race against time. There was insufficient anesthesia or adequate equipment for so many injured people. Improvised surgeries were performed quickly, while screams of pain and pleas echoed through the corridors. The floor, once clean and sterile, was now stained with blood and fragments of torn uniforms. Men with horrific injuries, torn arms, eyes pierced by shrapnel, faces unrecognizable, struggled for their lives under the dim light of the lamps. The exhausted rescuers continued to work tirelessly, ignoring their own injuries and fear, driven by the urgency to save lives. Many of those who arrived at the hospitals were already beyond help. Others were taken away from the chaos to makeshift wards, but the atmosphere was desperate. It was horror in its rawest form, the human aftermath of merciless attack. Meanwhile, Pearl Harbor was still bleeding. Cameras capture chaos. Amidst all the destruction and despair, there were those who fought to keep the memory of the massacre from fading into silence. Cameramen and photographers, some Navy officers, others reporters, were there to capture the inferno. Their cameras captured images that no filter could soften: devastating explosions, columns of black smoke rising into the sky, ships slowly sinking as sailors ran through the fire, and bodies lying motionless on the decks. These records were raw, brutal, and uncut, raw images of real horror, showing what the world would only come to understand later. The lenses focused on burning ships, smoke enveloping the wreckage, wounded and dead. Soldiers, faces frozen in expressions of fear, pain, or courage. Each frame was a slice of the tragedy, a testament to the surprise attack that shook the world. Despite the chaos, the cameramen remained steadfast, often risking their lives under fire to ensure the world did not forget what had happened. This footage would later be used to inform, mobilize, and above all remember, for on that day, history was written in blood, fire, and steel. The balance of tragedy, when the smoke finally began to clear, and a somber silence fell over what remained of Pearl Harbor. The true scale of the disaster emerged with brutality. In less than 2 hours, the Japanese attack had left a devastating trail. 2,403 Americans dead. Young men, fathers, brothers, friends, many of them dead before they even understood what had hit them. 1,178 injured, many with horrendous injuries that would change their lives forever. 8 warships sunk or seriously damaged, among them the mighty USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma, which became symbols of the tragedy. 188 planes destroyed, most of them crushed still on the ground, powerless against the surprise attack. Pearl Harbor, a base that symbolized American strength and security in the Pacific, had been reduced to a field of debris and death. The waters of the bay were still stained with oil, blood, and ash, a silent memorial to the men who would never return home. But this balance was not just material losses, it was the shock of an entire nation, the breaking of the illusion of invulnerability that many Americans carried. The attack had shown that war had come, and that America, until then distant from the conflict, could no longer remain neutral. As smoke and flames still rose over Pearl Harbor across the Pacific from Tokyo, news of the attack was greeted with celebration. The Japanese government and its military leaders celebrated the success of this audacious operation, believing they had dealt a decisive blow to the American Navy. For them, the attack meant opening the way for expansion into the Pacific, securing vital resources and strengthening their position in the war already consuming Asia. But on the other side of the globe, the reality was different. At the White House, the President Franklin D. Roosevelt received terrible news as the country awoke to the horror of that morning. With a grim face and a firm voice, he prepared a message that would go down in history. On December 8th, before Congress, Roosevelt delivered what he would call his Infamy Day speech, where he described the attack as an act of treason and cowardice, and called for the nation to declare war on Japan. The speech ignited the American soul, awakening a patriotic sentiment and a thirst for revenge that united a country previously divided over its involvement in World War II. The United States, until then on the back foot of the conflict, woke up to war with fury, determination, and a commitment to never allow that attack to be forgotten, or to ever be repeated. The world changed forever at that moment, with the formal declaration of war on Japan, signed just hours after the attack. World War II entered a new and terrifying phase. Pearl Harbor was the trigger that launched the United States into a global conflict whose fire would consume continents and oceans. The attack was not just a physical wound, but a call to all-out war, a life-or-death battle that would transform the fate of humanity. In the following weeks, Americans mobilized like never before. Industries began operating 24 hours a day, producing weapons, ships, and planes in a race against time. Young men left their homes to don uniforms, determined to avenge their brothers, fathers, and friends who fell at Pearl Harbor. In the Pacific, the fighting would be fierce and bloody. Islands would become battlefields, ships would explode on the high seas, planes would streak across the skies in fierce combat, and thousands of lives would be sacrificed. But amidst the pain and devastation, the flame of resistance and hope was born. Pearl Harbor, for all its horror, marked the beginning of a war that would change the world forever. A hell whose fire would consume evil and forge freedom. And so, the story that began with a peaceful Sunday ended with the deafening cry of a nation that refused to surrender.